Did someone say Halloween? Because that's what I brought. 5 different Halloween photo manipulation effects all in one video. We got witches, we got zombies, bloody vampires, ghosts, and what I'm gonna call a ghoul, all done in Affinity Photo. I'm Abby Esparza, and I've been creating creative composites for almost 10 years now, most of which have quite a few horror-inspired photo effects. All the resources featured today can be found over on Envato Elements, where you get unlimited downloads of graphics, photos, and fonts, all with super simple commercial licensing. Plus, a no-locking contract means you can cancel anytime. Subscribe now with the link down in the description. And we gotta get rolling because we have tons to get to today. For our first effect, we'll be covering my go-to technique for painting blood from scratch. Now, I am not a strong digital painter at all. So if you think you can't paint, don't worry, this is a very beginner-friendly technique. And after a few tries, you'll nail it no problem. I know it. So for our background, I'm going to just run through my layers real quick because they aren't anything special. We have a color fill layer for our base, then a moon image set to lighten. Remember, you can get all the images seen here over on Envato Elements, so you can follow right along. I also went ahead and masked some of the corners and added a lens blur live filter. I extracted the model using the same technique as our zombie, however I did accidentally rasterize the layer mask, which I never recommend doing. You want to try and keep your layer masks just in case you need to come back and make changes. You never know. But next up, I have a brightness contrast layer, adding a bit of shadow to the face, masked just to the right side. And it also has some blend option settings here. Now we can get to the blood. First, you'll want to create a blood color swatch set consisting of these 5 colors seen here. I'll refer to them as black, dark red, medium red, light red, and white from here on out. You can grab this right from the video, just click the color picker tool and drag it onto the swatches here. And Affinity Photo will grab the colors for you. You also don't have to make them in neat little squares like this. You can just create a new layer and paint a hard round spot of each color. Just something you can easily grab from. So let's create a new layer, setting it to overlay. If this layer was brighter, we might want to use multiply here. And while this technique will work on all surfaces and skin tones, you might have to tweak layer modes and colors to fit things appropriately. So it's best to practice on this exact image first, and then try playing with other images once you kind of understand how all the layers work together. Now we have to set up our brush. It's an easy one. Just a basic round brush with around 80% hardness, 20% spacing, and a 15% flow. If you're using a mouse, you should probably do around a 10% spacing with a 5% flow. Then we want to make sure wet is checked. That is very important. And if you're using a tablet, you'll likely want to turn on your pen pressure. Finally, some painting. With a medium red shade, we're going to paint the base of our blood. This will be the general shape you want your blood to be, the flow of blood. Don't be afraid of simple shapes. Looking at references is also a great idea, assuming you don't mind the sight of blood, of course. I do use a pen tablet, though a mouse can work perfectly fine for this part in particular. When working with a mouse, use the eraser brush to mimic the edges that the pen tablets can recreate a little bit more easily. And if you're using a pen tablet, you still want to use your eraser brush to shape your blood base. You'll notice I like to lay down a lot of paint and then erase, then lay down more. I really try not to overthink because I'm not a painter. So I'm just playing with things until they look good to me. It's going to look a little rough at this stage anyway. This effect comes together at the very end when we add in some nice shiny highlights, so just trust in the process and trust in your own eyes. This is looking good to me. Next, let's create a new layer above the base blood layer, setting that layer to multiply. On this layer, we'll be switching between both the medium red and the bright red. So we want to color grab both of those. Remember, on multiply layers, even bright colors will look dark. So this gives us two shades of essentially dark red to switch between. We'll also be switching between two brushes, the custom brush we made, and a soft round brush with a very low flow setting. We're going to be using those two brushes to darken specific areas of the blood. These areas are where the blood would be thickest. The thicker the blood, the darker the blood. This is where a reference photo really comes in handy, so you can see really how blood pools and kind of works. We want to use the soft round brush to blend any overly harsh edges, but we don't want things to look too soft because blood actually has a lot of structure and shape. It's more viscous, unlike water, which is very thin. So again, back to the idea of different environments needing different, layer modes. If this was a brighter image with less shadows and even less contrast, in that case you would need different layer modes. I also sometimes paint my darker reds first and then add in those lighter reds. I'll put a few examples of blood I've painted in the past. Again, it's the same general colors, brushes, and technique, but with a few changes to specific shades, order of operations, and tones of red. Sometimes I do a lot of painting on layers just set to normal. I chose this image especially for its ease of use, however. Thanks to its dark colors and very stylized lighting, the layer modes do most of the work. We only need to overlay and multiply. That's why I think this is a great practice image. And then once you're like, okay, I see what we're doing, then you can go on to the more brighter environments that are less likely to hide your mistakes. Once we're happy with our thicker areas of blood, we're going to paint in some shadows. Let's create a new layer set to multiply. We'll be using our soft round brush and the darker red color. Now these aren't typical shadows. We're going to use this layer to continue darkening that thicker part of blood, but we're going to also build up a bit of darkness around the edges of blood. So a shadow, but a very subtle one. We don't want to over-darken the medium red tones, or else things will start looking super flat and essentially like just black smudges. But these shadows will add a bit of dimension as well, so it's a balancing act. We want nice, thick, dark blood, and then lighter washes of that more vibrant red blood. It's best to bring your brush's flow down to 5% or less here, even if you're using a tablet. Building things up slowly is the name of the game. No harsh blobs. Take your time and use the eraser brush to keep things nice and blended. And again, keep an eye on your reference. So remember when I said highlights make this effect work? Well, it's time to add them. Let's create a new layer set to hard light. You can also try screen or even layer set to normal. Now we're going to grab our custom brush from earlier and duplicate it because we're going to make a slight variation of it. We want to make sure the pressure button up here is off if it's on, and then set the size to 2 pixels with a spacing of around 10%. Then we're going to go into dynamics and set the size jitter to 23%, making sure it's set to random. Now let's change our flow to just 5% and the opacity to around 75%. This will give us much more control over how much paint is exactly being laid down. Keep in mind that you'll be changing the brush size as you paint. So we're going to take our little brush and paint tiny little lines and spots of highlights. These highlights will show the shape of the blood, meaning if the blood is pooling in an area, the highlight will be maybe a bit round. On the parts of blood that are dripping down, the highlight will be a long line. You want to use your eraser brush to blend away parts of the highlight as you paint them. Don't try and paint exact shapes, just paint a general random shape, and then hit it with the eraser brush to fade it and shape it a bit more. Nothing too harsh, nothing too perfect. You'll also want to keep location in mind. If the blood is in a highly lit area, there will be more highlights and they will be stronger and more defined. The highlight will be less intense if the blood is in a shadowy area. Looking at our reference, the highlights are actually super smooth here. You can absolutely try and replicate them, but keep in mind that the blood is dripping on a very flat surface, with no curves or shapes. The highlights we're painting now are a bit more stylized and a lot more forgiving than the more photorealistic highlights. We still want to use this image as a reference. We are just making some slight changes, or at least I am. But at the end of the day, we're painting tiny little chaotic dots, so have fun with it. And then last, but certainly not least, let's create a new layer set to screen, and then place some red light blooms on parts of the blood that are getting a lot of light. Bringing that layer opacity down to 50% or even less, this really gives it a ruby red look, but it is optional. I am going to finish things off with an S-curve. That's a curve layer where we bring down the darks and increase the lights, creating that S shape. Adding a bit of contrast can also help things blend a bit more. I had a few mistakes here and there. And that's gonna finish out our blood effect. She has big vampire vibes to me, but I guess we'll never know without seeing those fangs. But we still have 4 more Halloween baddies to get through, and this next one is a whopper. So onwards to zombies. We'll be tackling a classic zombie. We'll be focusing on skin effects and old school missing tooth effect that I stole straight from Hollywood, and while we won't be adding any blood, he'd pair amazingly with that blood effect, let's be honest. Let's jump right into some prep work. So all of our images today will be created on a 1:1 ratio canvas, just to keep things consistent. I've already dropped in a creepy forest image and have my subject hidden here. But before we get to him, let's blur the background out using a lens blur live filter. Live filters can be found at the bottom of the layer panel to the right of the layer effects. We'll be using them quite a bit today. Let's go ahead and set the radius to around 10 pixels. Now you can drop in your subject, or in my case, I'm going to unhide him. We're going to duplicate the subject using Ctrl-J, and then bring the copy inside of the original. On the duplicated layer, we're going to go into the liquify persona. Now, if the liquify persona doesn't open up, you might need to right-click your layer and rasterize the image. But once we are inside, we'll use the liquify pinch tool to enlarge the eye and teeth. How big is going to be up to you. I wanted an almost cartoon or comic book-like effect. And enlarging the teeth will actually make it seem like the front jaw is pushed out forward. And we can also use the push forward tool to slightly pull down the lip. Basically, we just want his face to be a bit more zombie-like in his expression. So his base expression is looking good. Now let's extract him from his background. Let's use the flood select tool. With this stock image, we want to set the tolerance really low, around 5%. But since we selected the background and not him, we need to select inverse pixel selection. So now he's selected. And then we hit the refine button. We're going to use the foreground adjustment brush to grab any part of the subject that was accidentally selected. You can use the background brush if too much of the background is ever selected. With a subject on a white background like this, you shouldn't have to fuss around too much. Whenever you're happy, just press apply. Then we want to create a layer mask inside of the subject layer, but above the liquefied layer. Keep in mind that all future layers will be sandwiched in between the liquefied layer and this mask, until I say otherwise. Let's press Ctrl D to get rid of that selection, and we have our extracted subject. Almost. We still have quite a bit of fringe edge here, which is this leftover background. We can clean that up really quick by creating and clipping a minimum blur live filter into the mask. Again, just dragging and dropping. So our mask is clipped into the subject, while the live filter is clipped inside of the mask. We're going to bring up the radius of our minimum blur. The higher the radius, the more the layer mask will contract and hide that white edge. But we don't want to go too high. In fact, we can leave a small amount of that edge since we'll be adding a solid backlight effect a little later on. And with that, we can finally start on our zombie skin. We want to bring out some of the skin's natural texture using a high-pass live filter set to around 2 pixels. You could even go higher with this, honestly. And we want to set that to overlay. Next, a brightness contrast adjustment layer set to a negative 60% brightness and a 30% contrast. And then a black and white adjustment layer set to 40% opacity, and this will just give us a more natural base color to add some green to. Remember, you can always come back to these live filters and adjustments and change them around later. Now let's create an HSL adjustment layer above the black and white layer, and go into the reds of the image. Here, we want to target the reds of the skin. You can tell you have all the skin covered by bringing up the saturation to 100%. You may need to use the points on the color wheel to better pinpoint the colors of the skin. This time around, however, we got super lucky, and the default red seemed to grab everything just fine. So, we want to find a nice rotten green color. I found that for this skin tone, a hue of negative 35, a saturation of negative 1, and a luminosity of negative 10 worked really well. Like most things, these settings will change from image to image and depend on personal preference, what shade of green you want him to be, or any shade of color, really. Real quick, let's take a soft black brush and mask away any green on the teeth and eyes and a bit from the lips, just so he's not one flat color. You can also add different shades of green to his skin, or maybe even some blue tones. Today we'll stick with one shade of green, but there's a lot of room to play here. Next, let's create a brightness contrast adjustment right above that HSL layer, setting it to negative 41 brightness and a 47 contrast. This will darken the subject a bit, but we want to mask most of that darkness from the subject's face and inner neck. Keep the edges of the jawline a bit dark, as well as the outer parts of the neck touching the shirt. This will be the start of the subject's shadows, almost like a base. Now we're going to do some painting. Our zombie is mostly bloodless, but we definitely don't want him to be too clean. So let's add some dirt and muck, mainly to his clothes. Create a new layer set to overlay above the brightness contrast layer, and let's bring the opacity down to around 60% for now. We can always bring it up later if we need to. Let's select the brush tool and go into the brushes panel. From the drop-down, choose textures. And let's grab the first brush here. Then let's set our colors to a dark red and then a dark brown. We'll be switching back and forth between these colors using X. If you're using a mouse, you'll want to bring your flow even lower than the default setting, I'd say 10% or less. This will help you build up color more gradually. And we're just going to add some grime and muck to our zombie's clothes. Just paint very sloppy, switching between the two colors and building up different shades and tones of color on that shirt. If it gets on the skin, that's fine. We just want to primarily focus on the shirt and clothes. Affinity Photo has some really lovely default brushes. Feel free to try out some of the other ones. I only use one just to keep things kind of simple for the tutorial, but mixing textures is always a good thing. The clothes are looking good, so let's get back to the shadows. Let's create a layer new fill layer right above our dirt details and set its layer mode to multiply. This will be the color of our darkest shadow. I'm going to set it to a desaturated semi-dark brown color. So let's go into the Layers Blend options by choosing the cog icon in the Layers panel. Here you'll see two boxes. We want to focus on the underlying layer option. Here we can bring down the right of the curved line. Let's bring it about 3/4 of the way down. And you'll see that the shadows blend away from some of the highlights in the image. If you're familiar with Blend If in Photoshop, this is Affinity Photo's equivalent. But we can also click on the middle of the line to add a point, and then use that to make even more minor adjustments. We just want some of the highlights to show through, giving the shadows a bit more dimension, nothing crazy. We don't want them to shine 100% through, as we still want the shadows to be pretty dramatic, and they're shadows, so they need to be pretty dark. This looks good for now. You can always adjust this later if you ever need to. It is non-destructive. Let's create a mask and drop it into that fill layer. We want to mask the shadows away from the face, focus the shadows on the shirt, neck, and bottom of the chin. Try and follow the natural edges of the subject. So if there is a fold that would be catching more light, mask away some of the shadows there. We're just using a soft round brush, and again this may be a good time to really lower that flow. Next, let's drop in this rust texture from Envato Elements and use it as a base for some rotting skin. We're bringing that layer right above the shadow layer and shrinking it down to about the width of the head, maybe a little larger. Let's set the layer mode to overlay and add a layer mask to the texture. Then let's add an HSL adjustment right below the layer mask, bringing the saturation down to a -100. I'm going to set this rust layer right over the neck and bottom of the chin just for now, and that's because we need at least one copy of this layer anyway to cover the whole subject. But first, let's invert the layer mask using Ctrl-I, turning the layer mask black. And then we're going to go ahead and Ctrl-J to duplicate. And this extra texture will be for the forehead of the subject, so we can hide the mask for a moment, bring that onto the forehead, and then turn the mask back on once we like our placement. So now we have two hidden textures that we can start masking using a soft black brush. Mask in the texture slowly, making sure everything blends seamlessly. You don't want areas to look too over-processed. You also don't want any of these textures on the clothes. However, don't be afraid to bring some of that texture on to places like the gums. Again, this is meant to mimic decaying skin, so just try and keep that in mind as you paint. Many of our zombie textures and effects will be enhanced by the final color grade, so do keep that in mind as well. He seems a bit flat right now, but our final layers will pump up his contrast and colors. But with everything masked, we can collapse and close up the subject and move on to some final effects. All these layers will be placed outside of our main subject, because we're going to start working on some smaller details, starting with removing some of these teeth. This is actually incredibly simple. We're just going to create a new layer, color pick from the darkest part of the inner mouth here, and then paint. The color will be close to black, but not quite. Black will often appear a little too flat or dark, so opt for even a slightly off black. Keep your brush mostly hard, but then smudge out the edges of the missing teeth and spots using the smudge tool. You'll want to really smudge out the bottom of the missing teeth. That'll give you the appearance of depth. The easiest teeth to remove will be the ones that don't overlap any other teeth, primarily the bottom row. We'll be adding some darker color to the teeth, and the color grade will darken things even further. Both will help blend the missing teeth to look more natural. They definitely look a little solid right now, but the color grade really makes the image here. So don't overthink things, we really are just painting black on teeth. Once the teeth are looking good, we can start adding some rot to them. They are definitely a little too white right now. Let's create a new layer set to multiply, and choose a muddy yellow color, painting it all over the teeth. The yellow can be slightly on the gums, but really want to focus on the teeth. Now let's go back into the blend options and bring down the right of the curve, just like we did with the shadow, pulling it about 3/4 of the way down. This will bring some of the highlights back to the teeth. We want them rotted, but still kind of shiny and moist. Now we're going to refocus on the skin, add a bit more detail, focusing on doing an ultra quick missing nose effect. Let's drop in and size an image of a skull. Set the layer mode to overlay, and then we want to make sure it lines up with our subject's face. The eyes with the eye sockets and the nose with the nose. Things don't have to be perfect, just a general alignment. Okay, now we're going to clip a black and white adjustment layer into that skull, and then a brightness contrast adjustment, setting that to -50% brightness and a 50% contrast. Let's also bring the skull's opacity down to 70% or so. Now we're going to add a layer mask and mask away any part of the skull that we don't want to show. Use a soft round brush and try and make things blend smoothly and seamlessly, as always. I focused the skull around the eyes and nose and slightly onto the forehead. Just slightly. That's looking good, but we're going to deepen that skull texture even more by duplicating the skull and changing its layer mode to soft light. We're going to bring the opacity down to 50% as well. Now we can delete the layer mask and add in a fresh new one, inverting the new mask using Control I. Now we can enhance parts of the skull texture with a soft white brush. Again, I focused on the eyes and nose, but also brought the texture onto the forehead a bit more. Now we're going to create a new layer under the skull textures and fill the nose area with a flat black. Follow the shapes of the skull texture and try and keep a dark split-like shape down the middle for this bone here. I'm not sure what that bone is called. I used a semi-hard round brush for this. We want the edges to be slightly soft but not overly blended, similar to the missing teeth. It's almost like a real horror movie. Everything looks better in the dark. But to make things slightly less flat, we're going to go into the blend option and bring the right curve anchor down about halfway, just to bring in a bit of highlight. It's still very obscured. We don't want it to be obvious that his nose is under there. Just that there is something under there. Now you could also create a new layer and paint in some small lines of highlight on the edges of the nose here. We're going to keep moving on though, because we're about to finish things up with some zombie eyes. Create a new layer, set the screen. We also want to lower the opacity down to 60%. Now let's grab a soft round brush, and we want to size the brush to be the size of the zombie's iris. If you want the eye to look like it's glowing, then you can make the brush size a tad bit bigger. I'm going for more of a cataract effect. You can increase and decrease your brush size using the left and right bracket keys. Now let's create another new layer, set to screen, and bring it down to 80% or so. Change the brush hardness to 80%, and then size the brush down to the size of the zombie's pupil. We're going to place a dot right on that iris. If you want it to be brighter, you can bring the opacity back up to 100%. You could even duplicate this layer once you're all done with it. Grab a soft eraser brush and remove a small amount of color right from the top of the pupil. This will give the eye a little bit more dimension. Make it a little less flat. You can also do an easy bloodshot eye effect using a layer set to overlay, and then paint a bright red right into the corners of the eye. Try to keep it right into the corners, bleeding inwards. Nothing too harsh. You almost want it to look like strings of veins. And while you could absolutely do the same effect to both eyes, I think it'd be cool to fill the smaller eye with black, leaving just the highlight. Flat black on a layer set to color burn should work just fine in this case. Again, we want to make sure we leave that nice shine in the eye. And I almost forgot about the backlighting. This is a very optional, but an easy way to add a bit of a style to an image. Let's go to our subject and duplicate and rasterize. Now create and clip a colorful layer set to a light blue color into that rasterized copy of our subject. Rasterize those two layers together and set the layer mode to screen. We've basically created a flat blue silhouette of our zombie. And from here we can use the warp mesh tool to create peeking lights from behind the subject, or a harsh rim light effect. You want to ensure that it's not a solid line, so double click to make points in the mesh so you can more accurately warp things around. If that doesn't work, you can always add a layer mask and use a semi-hard round black brush to mask away some of the harsher, thicker areas of light. I want the left side of my subject to have most of the highlights, with just some of the light peeking on the right side. You can also use the smudge tool to create little light blooms or inconsistencies in the light, which is a good thing here. We just don't want it to look like a solid stroke effect. And one final tip, you can paint little strings or pieces of thread coming from the shirt. Paint them in the same color as the rim light, so that they look like little pieces of thread getting caught in the light. And now we just have to pull things together with the color grade. Let's go back to the top of our canvas and create a curves adjustment layer. We're going to create something called an S-curve. It's called that because we're going to make 2 points. One brings up the highlights, and the other brings down the shadows. This turns the curve into an S-like shape, and is a great way to add contrast to an image. And now a LUT adjustment layer, using the pre-made LUT from this pack over on Envato Elements. I'll be using this pack throughout the whole course, so all of my spooky LUTs all come from this one pack. The exact LUT is called Ghost 04, and we're going to bring that down in opacity at least a little bit, or a lot. And that's my classic zombie effect. I think he's super cute, and I hope you like him as much as I do. He might be my favorite of the bunch today. And you can do so much more with him, add more highlights, more colors, more texture, and of course, add some blood. But we're moving on to creature effect number 3, witches, or more accurately, a few quick but vibrant magical effects that any self-respecting witch would love. This image is all about glowy effects and how you can mix and match them to create all kinds of different spells and maybe even some hexes. Or in this case, a really cool under the floorboards creepy glow effect. We really want to focus on those glow effects, but we do have a bit of prep work to do first, starting with changing the light source of the image to be a nice vibrant green color. Let's create an HSL layer and go into the yellow tones, as most of the original light is yellow based. Now let's set the hue to a lime green shift, which ends up being around -112. And let's boost up that saturation to 45% or so. This changed some of the lighting, but to ensure everything is a true vibrant green, we want to grab the top point here on the hue circle and pull it up. More and more of those red tones will be grabbed. Right about here is looking good, but we also want to bring up the second point here. This is all very visual. See how the colors shift and make tiny changes until you're happy with the result. We want the light source and some of the skin to be lime green, with most of those shadows remaining skin toned. Hue shifts like this will change drastically from image to image, but the technique will stay the same. For example, we'd go into the blue tones if her original lighting were blue. Also, this is the layer where you'll decide the color of your surrounding effects. So if you want to recreate this image in blue, you can use the hue shift setting and bring it to a blue tone instead of that green. Then later on, when I say green, do a blue color instead. You can do any of these effects with any nice, vibrant color. With that looking good, let's lay down a brightness contrast layer set to -17 brightness and 9% contrast. Then we can get to our first glow effect, fire. I'll be using these super cool 3D assets from Envato Elements. What's great about these assets is that we can download this one flame, but at 5 different angles. This gives us 5 similar but different looking flames. Drop all of those in and set them to screen. Then we're going to go up to the options bar and align them to be centered both vertically and horizontally, just so they are all placed on top of each other in a nice, neat stack. And then we'll stretch them up vertically so they look like they are shooting upwards. Time to give each candle a flame. Just place them over the original flame, don't worry about adjusting their size just yet. I find batching similar actions together easier than doing everything one by one. So once every candle has a flame, we can go in and then size each flame to fit the candle. The changes should be pretty minor. The candle's flame in front will be slightly bigger than the flames in the back. We will also need to add a layer mask to the 2 back flames and mask the areas covered by the hands and arms. It doesn't have to be perfect, a soft round black brush should work just fine. In fact, it's fine to have a bit of glow showing through the fingers as opposed to overly masking and having a dark background there, because that wouldn't make too much sense. With everything masked and sized up correctly, let's find all the fire layers and group them using Ctrl-G. Once grouped, we can create an HSL layer inside that group, but above all 5 flame layers, setting it to -60 hue and a 26% saturation. This should turn the flames a nice vivid lime green color to pair with the surrounding lime green lighting. And we're going to finish up the fire with one of my favorite tricks, painting a bit of solid color behind each flame. In this case, green, but you'd use whatever color your flame is if it's not green. And this is on a new layer below the flame group. This will just make the fire appear a bit more solid, as fire isn't as transparent as a lot of people think. And when you set fire to just screen, it'll be very see-through and, I call it Photoshoppy. Now on to some glowing, almost ghost-like smoke. Let's create a new layer, then find a smoke brush set with some nice big wispy smoky trails. We want static stamp brushes. Static Photoshop brushes like these are all compatible with Affinity Photo, and you can import them using the brush panel here. I'll be using brush 1, the first brush here, but there are 60 of them, so you can always mix and match. So let's create a new layer, set to color dodge. When it comes to magical glowing effects, color dodge and screen are going to be your dream team. We're going to set the color to a super bright neon lime green, almost yellow. Then let's stamp some smoke anywhere is fine. Because we'll be using the transform tools to place and angle our smoke. We want it to be coming from the front of the candle and almost wrapping around the subject's face. This is looking okay, but to enhance that wrapping effect, we can use the Mesh Warp tool. Double click to create a point, and then pull to warp. Very simple to use. Don't overthink it too much, we just want the smoke to feel nice and flowy. If you like how the smoke initially looked, you can even skip this step actually. You don't have to worry too much about the bottom of the flame, we'll be taking care of that here in a second. Just focus on the overall flow of the smoke and how it's wrapping around our subject. We want to pull all the attention to the face here. Now that the smoke is looking good, we can add a layer mask to that smoke, and then we're going to mask out any areas we simply don't like, using a soft round brush. For me, it's the bottom of the smoke here, so I just went ahead and just blended that out. Now let's take that smoke and copy it using Ctrl J. First, you'll see this is an excellent way to intensify the smoke effect if you wanted to. But what I'm going to do is use this copy to make a second smoke trail coming from the opposite side. This will add a touch more drama. You'll also want to use that warp mesh tool again and do a bit of masking to this layer. And this will finish up the spooky smoke, though keep in mind that you can use these same techniques to create some really cool magic wand effects. My favorite part of this image is actually the glowing floorboards, so let's finally dive into those. Let's create a new layer and grab the brush tool. We're going to set our color to a pale lime green, and the brush tip to a semi-hard round brush. Then we're going to paint scratchy, inconsistent lines between the cracks of the floorboard. I mentioned scratchy and inconsistent because you do not want them to be perfect. You want the bright lines to be directly under the subject, while the lines further from that subject get thinner and less bright. You don't want anything to be harsh. Make sure things taper out. Zoomed up close, this will actually look a little odd, but don't worry, everything will start to blend out once we add more lighting effects. If you don't have a tablet like I do, you can use a soft eraser brush to taper out and blend edges of the lines to get these kind of tapered effects in the wood. Add as many lines as you want, just try and keep the brightest lines under that subject. And we'll call this done. So what we're going to do now is add an outer glow layer effect found down here in the layers panel. Set the color to a neon lime green, and the opacity to around 75%. The radius and intensity can vary, but I landed on 20 pixels for the radius and 50% for the intensity. Let's Ctrl J to duplicate that layer, and then go to Filter, Blur, Motion Blur. Click, drag, and pull on the layer to create a long slanted light. We want it to appear like the light is shining up through those floorboards. This is almost like a laser effect. Once that initial light is looking good, we can create a new layer and grab the pen tool. We're going to create a path going from the top of a crack in the wood to the bottom. Then we can go up and stroke the path with a pale light green color. Make the line pretty thick at 20 or 22 pixels. We also want to add some pressure, recreating a curve that looks like a frowny face. We want to do that to almost all of the cracks in the wood, avoiding the outermost cracks. Again, try and keep the focus on where the subject is. The stroke settings should save themselves, so you don't have to keep redoing those settings over and over again. And I like to keep each stroke on its own layer, just in case I need to make any minor transform effects or moving them around, anything like that. Once you have your strokes, group and rasterize them. And we want to keep a copy of this intact as all times, because we'll be duplicating from it a few different times. So let's duplicate it once, and then hide the original for now. Let's change the copy's layer mode to soft light, and go to Filter, Blur, Motion Blur. Again, we want to click and drag and pull to create laser-like lines coming from the floorboards. We are basically intensifying what we laid down before. I'm looking for some almost solid lines of light to start forming. I'll point to them on screen, just so you get an idea of what I'm looking for. Because we're going to repeat that step over and over until we have nice, tall, bright lights. So duplicate the base light layer again, bring it above the previous copy, and change the layer mode to either soft light, overlay, or color dodge. You'll want to experiment with a combination of those three layer modes. You will want to adjust the direction and height of the motion blur for each. Some should lean right while others will lean left. Again, keep an eye out for any interesting lines and shapes forming in that light. You can of course lower the opacity of some of the layers or even mask out any places that look a little wonky. To keep things simple, I kept everything at 100% opacity and didn't do any masking, but you can definitely enhance this effect with both. Let's finish off the lights with a few blooms of saturated lime green on a new layer set to soft light. We want to place these light blooms primarily where the floorboard lights are, trying to avoid the face. And we can bring down the opacity to around 40% or so, just so it's not so intense. Add a selective color adjustment to do a quick color grade. We're going to go into the blacks and bring down the cyans to -20, which will bring some red into the shadows. And then deepen the blacks about 6% to add a bit of contrast. And then one final tweak because I think she needs it. Let's go back to that first HSL layer that is shifting her green and mask some of the green just from her face, just using a soft round brush. Primarily the left side of her face here was looking a little too green, almost She-Hulkish. And that's going to be a wrap on our witch. I mentioned earlier that these effects can really be any color. You can even go more subtle if you're not feeling the bright and vivid colors. This is just a base for a slew of bigger and badder glow effects. But we're moving on to the next spooky effect, because this tutorial would not be complete without at least one kind of ghosts. And she looks legitimately horrifying behind me right now. For our fourth image, we'll be creating a ghost with a different kind of transparency effect. We'll just need one stock image, and best of all, very little extracting. Music to my ears. But this one is all about layering and layer modes. Let's make ourselves a ghost. So first, we want to duplicate our subject using Ctrl-J. We'll be returning to this layer a couple of times throughout the tutorial. Plus, we always want to make sure we have a backup of our subject anyway, just in case we need it. Now we're going to remove our subject from the background using the patch tool. We're going to select an area and move to a new area. The new area will patch over the old. This is what's going to give us our transparent effect. It's best to patch using a few medium selections rather than one giant selection. This doesn't have to be perfect, in fact, it will likely look kind of bad. And that's okay, as we'll return to it a little bit later. You can also extract your subject and place her in a whole new background. I thought trying to keep her in her original location but making her transparent was just kinda cool. In fact, this is a pretty tricky image to do this kind of effect on, since we have very little excess background to patch from. So you can see that I'm not trying to recreate what the actual background would look like if she wasn't there. More so, just making things look plausible, if not a little abstract. Again, this just does not need to be perfect. This looks fine for now. Let's move on and create two new layers, setting one to overlay and the other to soft light. On the overlay layer, let's add white to the middle of the canvas using the brush tool with a big fluffy soft brush. And then we'll use that soft light layer to create a vignette effect, painting black on the edges of the canvas. We'll use the same brush for both. Then let's create a black and white adjustment layer set to 50% opacity and 0% red. This will desaturate all of those bright reds in the image, darkening them as well. Let's also create a brightness contrast adjustment layer and set the brightness to -70 and the contrast to +10%. And we'll finish off the adjustments for the background with a layer new fill layer. Let's set it to a dark blue navy color and a layer mode of subtract, bringing the opacity down to 50% or so. Keep in mind that settings like these rarely need to be exact. These just set the color grade for the ghost environment. If you wanted something bright and vibrant, then feel free. Time to select the subject on the ghost layer using the selection brush. Click and drag to make a selection. We don't need it to be overly precise. Because now we can use the refine button in the upper options bar. Keep in mind that some fringe edge is actually fine here, as it'll add a slight glowing outline to our subject a little later on. Also, the selection in general just doesn't need to be perfect due to the nature of ghosts not being completely there anyway. Basically, you don't need to fuss around too much with the extraction portion. Once you're happy with the selection, just create and clip a mask right onto the ghost layer. And from here, we want to go back to the background layer we patched earlier and continue to refine it using the patch tool. It still doesn't need to be perfect. In fact, you most likely won't be able to make it perfect. Most of the background will stay mostly obscured in the end. But what we have now is a better idea of how the background will interact with the ghost effect. If you're having a hard time with the background, you can create a lens blur layer right above the background here, and bring the radius up just enough to hide any overly blotchy areas. Make sure you mask out the suitcase, however, as you don't want that to be blurry. And so she's transparent, but we definitely want her to be much more ghost-like. Let's duplicate the ghost effect, including their layer masks, and change the layer mode from screen to soft light. Now we can clip an HSL adjustment into the second ghost layer, setting it to -75 saturation. And then a recolor adjustment set to 200 hue and a 60% saturation. This combo should give you a ghostly gray tint. Our ghost will end up a very blue toned ghost, but if you want her to be green or any other color, these blue layers are where you'll want to choose that color. Next, let's duplicate the original ghost layer and bring it to the top of the layer stack. Set the layer mode to screen and the opacity to 90%. Let's create and clip a recolor adjustment layer into the new ghost layer, setting it to 200 hue and a 23% saturation. Now we want to focus most of the brightness on the middle of the subject. So let's create and clip a brightness contrast layer into the third ghost layer. Set the brightness to -61%, give or take, and the contrast to 100%. Then using a soft round brush set to black, we want to mask the darkness away from the middle of the subject. When masking adjustment layers, you don't need to create a layer mask, just paint directly black or white right onto the layer. This looks good for now. We can always come back and tweak things later on. And then we can group all of those ghost layers. If there are a lot of white edges, you can clean them up by creating a layer mask in that group, then using a soft round brush, mask out the edges. Again, some of the white edges will give off almost a glowing rim light effect, so we want to try and keep some of those. Just remove the ones that don't look so good. And we really have our ghost, but she definitely needs some glow in my opinion. Let's group all the layers we have so far, including the background, and name the group main subject. Then we're going to duplicate that group and right-click rasterize. Change the copy's layer mode to overlay. We're going to create and clip a layer mask into that copy, and then invert it using Ctrl-I. This will turn the layer mask black. So now we can use a soft white brush to mask the middle of the image back in. We're focusing on the subject, giving her a soft glow of contrast. And then we'll make that glow even glowier by clipping in a Gaussian blur live filter into that copy, setting the radius to 28 to 30 pixels. Now create and clip an invert adjustment layer above the Gaussian blur layer, and then a recolor layer above the invert layer, setting it to a hue of 210 and a 30% saturation with a -26 lightness. This will turn it blue. We're now going to go back into the main subject group and duplicate the original ghost layer set to screen. Bring the copy to the top of the layer stack and set it to soft light at 85% opacity. Create and clip a Gaussian blur live filter into the newest ghost layer, setting the radius to 55 pixels. So nice and blurry. And then finally create a new layer set to screen, and using a very large soft round brush, paint a bloom of light blue, light coming right from the center of the subject. Lower the opacity to 30% to give or take, just to give a subtle glow. We just have a few more final touches to go, starting with bringing out the facial details with some dark blotchy makeup. Let's create a new layer set to overlay, and on this layer we're going to use a soft black brush to enhance the dark circles under the eyes, along with the cheeks, nose, and lips. Use multiple layers to get an even darker effect, or lower the opacity to create a less intense effect. Now for the eyes, which are actually super simple, and very similar to our zombie eyes. We're going to create a new layer set to screen, and use a soft, small round brush to paint light blue right on the eyes of the subject. You want the brush to be the size of the subject's iris, and then a little bit bigger than that to give a more glowy effect. And then we're going to click once on each eye. Next, create a new layer set to color dodge, and use a 75% hard round brush to paint a dot of pale blue right on each pupil. If the pupil is too harsh, You can use a soft eraser brush to remove some of the opacity of the pupils. I like to erase the top of the pupils just slightly. This will also help them look a little less flat. And if you want the eyes to be extra bright, go ahead and duplicate the layer using Ctrl J, which I'm going to do. Finish everything up with a brightness contrast layer set to -5 brightness and a 20% contrast. And then a color balance layer set to -37 red with a 34% blue. A LUT layer where I loaded up the Ghost 10 pre-made LUT. Remember, you can grab this whole LUT pack over on Envato Elements. I'm also going to bring this LUT layer down to 20% opacity, something nice and low. And we'll finish everything off with a nice noise live layer, with around 15% noise. This just gives the image a bit more grain, and I think it fits with the ghosty theme. And that's it for our ghost. Remember, she's super customizable. You can swap out different colors, adjustments, and even layer modes. She's a great image to experiment with because there's just no one way to get this effect. There are about a million ways to make a ghost. We have just one more horror-inspired effect to go, or should I say two. A stitched thread effect, but also a face painting effect. While we'll be doing a skull-like classic paint, sticking with black and white, you could do any design using any color. This is another technique I've been doing for years, and I just kinda really love it. Super excited to get into it, let's do it. Again, let's go through the background layers quickly, so we can get to the fun stuff. We have our base forest here, with a lens blur live filter. Then a copy of that layer, but without its lens blur, set to lighten with a motion blur layer instead inside of it. On top of that, another copy set to color dodge at 25% opacity. That also has that same motion blur layer inside. Next, a brightness contrast adjustment layer. And our subject was extracted using the same method as our zombie. And for the shadows and lighting, again, it's the same general method as the zombie, but let's break them down. This layer set to screen is used to brighten up and fill in all the little stray hairs around the subject's face, painted using a soft round brush and a bright orange. Then we have two layers set to multiply, building up shadows. They also have some blending options set as well. And we did the backlight hair by duplicating the subject, filling that with a solid color, and then setting it to screen. Warping it so that just some of the light peeks from behind the subject. Use layer masks to hide any areas that simply don't look right. We'll have to return and make some minor adjustments to the subject after we lay down our face paint, so let's start creating our white paint layers. It all starts with an HSL layer, set to -100 saturation, and then we'll bring down the opacity to around 60% or less. The exact number will depend on how white you want the paint to appear. This desaturation will be the base color for our face paint. We will also slightly shift the hue to -7.5 to be a bit more orange. The white paint would be picking up a bit of color from the orange environment, so you'd pick a color that best reflects your character's environment. Under that HSL layer, we want to create a brightness contrast layer set to 13% brightness and -23% contrast. These settings are specific to this image in this scenario. These numbers can and will change, but the general rule is to lower the contrast by a good amount and bring up the brightness by a very small amount. Nothing crazy. We don't want her to look overly bright or glowing. Just slightly more white. Then we can go ahead and group those two layers together. Next, we want to go back into our subject and duplicate their mask. Bring that copy into the new group above the two adjustment layers. Let's create a second layer mask under that copied mask, but above the adjustments. Invert the layer mask using Ctrl-I to turn it black. And on this layer, we're going to mask our actual face paint. So let's set our color to white and choose one of the brushes in the oils category. You can also try any other default brushes or any of your own brushes, but the oil brushes will give you really nice brush stroke textures. You can make this as clean or as messy as you'd like. I want it to be very, dirty with a lot of texture and visible strokes. Very sloppy looking. Feel free to use a soft round brush to blend out any edges, and you want to keep the natural shape and textures of the areas in mind. For instance, you want to take extra care around the hairline and the lips. Think of the creases in the skin, or where the paint would be rubbing off, or maybe building up. Things like that. I think this is looking good for now, so let's move on to the actual design of the face. We're going to create a new brightness contrast adjustment layer outside of the white face paint group, setting it to -100 brightness and 100 contrast. And then an HSL layer set to -25% saturation. Let's group these together. This will be our black paint base. So this is the black equivalent of our white paint. With our white paint laid down, we can make our final adjustments to the subject before adding in our black paint. So let's go back into our subject, and below the shadow layers, create a brightness contrast adjustment. Let's set it to a -10% brightness and a 50% contrast. Since the paint makes the face look a little too bright, she loses a lot of her definition in her skin, and I want to increase the overall contrast in both her face and her hair and clothes. Now we can collapse that subject as we are completely done with her, and we can go on to our black paint. Just like with the white paint, we're going to create a layer mask inside the group, but above the two adjustments. Invert it using Ctrl-I to fill it with black. And then mask in our black paint. When painting, I suggest using a semi-hard round brush to paint in your initial design, in this case a skull, and then go back and rough up that design using the watercolor brushes, oil brushes, or a soft round brush. I actually really liked how the watercolor brushes looked as opposed to the oil brushes, particularly this large, dense watercolor brush looked really nice with the black paint. It's the very last brush in the default water brushes here. But like I said, you can use all different kinds of brushes, whatever is going to get you the effect that you want. I'm using a reference for this, I'll put it up on screen. Using a reference makes this much easier if you're not a strong painter, and as I've mentioned, I am not a strong painter. Again, you can make this as clean or as messy as you'd like. I like things to look very messy and sloppy. Now, you can change the color of the black or white paint by creating any color changing adjustment or layer above those two adjustments. I do suggest staying away from pure white or pure black. Both of our black and white have a tinge of orange to them. So you just want to try and add at least a tiny bit of color when creating layers like this. It can be the surrounding background color like we did here with that orange, or it can be just a tinge of blue. A lot of white and black paint is naturally a bit very slightly blue. Adding some color will help your image from looking flat and lifeless. There are very few things in the world that are a true flat black or a true flat white. Same with shades of gray. They almost always lean either warm or cool. It's just something to keep in mind when choosing your colors. You also see me masking both in and out. If I want to add some white to this black paint, I'm actually just masking out the black. And of course, when I want to add more black, I'm masking in that black paint. Play with your flow setting. A lower flow will make it so you can make these really subtle blotches of black paint that look like they're almost mixing in with the white paint. It's all very freeform, freehand. Just have fun with this, because it's very fun. I very much enjoy doing this effect. With that done, we have one more step, but it is crucial. Our black face paint looks super flat. So let's select the brightness contrast layer in that black paint group and open its blending options. We're going to bring the rightmost curve point all the way down. Then we're going to create a point right here on this crisscross section, and then pull that all the way up. Then we'll start to move it to the right little by little until only the highest points of the skin texture have highlights on them. This will give the paint more texture and make it appear slightly shiny, like actual oil paint would be. Now we're going to add in our stitches. I was originally going to paint the stitches into the face for a nice little, stitched skull effect, but then I thought actual stitches would look pretty cool. So let's create a new layer and set our brush color to a dark brown. Now you can make the base for your stitches in one of two ways. First, if you have a tablet, you can paint them using a hard round brush with a size jitter of 50% pressure. We want to make sure it's set to pressure. Make quick half loops, and you'll make super simple stitch-like shapes. I'm making them nice and thick for a cartoony-like effect, but if you want them thinner, they will appear even more realistic. However, if you don't have a tablet, you can use the pen tool instead. Place 2 points, creating a path with a curve in whatever shape you want the thread to be. Now add a stroke, your choice of thickness, and then choose your color. And then we're going to go into pressure and make a frowny face, just like we did with our glowing floorboards effect. Now the great thing here is you have tons of control. Move the top point to the left and right, and the 2 other points up and down until you like the shape and flow of your stitch. You'll want to repeat this for every single one of your stitches. Once you have your stitches, group and rasterize them together. I'm going to paint mine as it's quicker for me, but the pen tool is a great option. Now this is very, very important. Whether you use the pen tool or the brush tool, you want to make sure you have 2 sets of stitches. The stitches going over and then the stitches going under should both be on separate layers. Otherwise, painting or adding in shadows and highlights is going to be way harder later on. So we have 2 layers of stitches, the ones that go over and the ones that go under. While there's still a flat brown color, it's hard to tell that they're on 2 different layers, but they are. And if you wanted even more stitches overlapping those, just make a new layer. I just did the 2 for now. Once we're happy with those stitches, we want to add some lighting and shading to them. You can absolutely hand paint them in. Usually that is what I would recommend and what I would do myself. But I know that can be hard with no tablet, or even if you have a tablet, maybe you're not very used to it yet. So here's another option. We're going to add a bevel and emboss layer effect to each of the stitch layers. You'll want to play with the settings here so that they best suit your specific stitches and your image, but these settings worked for me. We do want the type to always be inner. And then I set the radius to around 33% pixels, give or take. None of these have to be exact. A depth of 72 pixels. We'll set soften to 1 pixel. And set the direction to 110 degrees. And then 52 degrees for this bottom number. We'll change the highlight to be a vivid orange color. Set to 21%. With a dark brown shadow, set to 100%. And you want to give each set of stitches its own care and attention. You'll likely have to add some shadows to the bottom stitch layer, painting dark brown on a layer set to multiply. This is so it's clear that there is a set of stitches going over top and a set of stitches going under. So just very quick shadows on those underlying stitches. So we've done the lighting inside the stitches, but we still need to add some shadows being cast by them. So let's create a new layer below the stitch layers, setting it to multiply. Now with a semi-soft round brush set to a flow of 5%, we will slowly build up the shadows under those stitches. The shadow should be the darkest where the stitch meets the skin, and then get lighter as the stitch moves away from the skin. It's best to build the shadows up slowly, and then you can use a soft eraser brush to blend out any smudgy or janky looking shadows. You also want to make sure the shadows do have some form or shape to them. You don't want them to look too soft or like giant blobs of darkness. Next, for some holes. These stitches need to be entering something after all. Now, suppose you want this to be a more horror or gory like effect. In that case, you want the holes to be very small, and you'll want to paint in shadows and highlights that make the skin look puckered and pulled. Right here around the edges where the stitch is entering the skin. But we'll be creating larger, almost mask-like holes. Definitely very stylistic. A little less gore and a little bit more Halloween funsies. So on a new layer, we're going to paint a light gray hard round dot right at the end of each thread, both sides. The color will 100% depend on the subject. In this case, a medium dark orange tone gray worked pretty well. With all of our dots placed, we want to add a small amount of filter Gaussian blur, just 0.2 pixels, just enough to make them not too harsh. And now we're going to duplicate the dots and clip a color fill layer into that duplicate. The color should be a very dark brown for that fill layer. And then we can rasterize the two layers together. So now we have a set of light gray holes, or medium gray holes, and then dark brown holes. We're going to drop the dark brown dots into the gray dots. And then use the arrow keys to shift the dark dots around so that the gray dots start creating this light edge here, creating a hole punch effect. Now, just a few lighting tricks to finish things up and definitely bring everything together. Let's do an eye effect similar to our zombie and ghost eyes. In fact, it's the exact same one. Create a new layer set to screen. We also want to lower that down to around 60%. Then grab a soft round brush the size of the subject's iris. Set our brush color to a nice vivid orange, and dab a bloom of light on each eye. Then create another new layer set to screen. Change the brush hardness to 80% and size the brush down to the pupil's size. And we're going to place a dot right on that pupil. If you want the effect to be a little less harsh, grab a soft eraser brush and remove a small amount of color from that top pupil. Next, let's bring in some ambient lighting on a new layer set to screen, and then using a soft round brush, we'll paint blooms of orange light right around that subject. Make sure the brush is set to a low flow so you can build that light up slowly. You can also paint some highlights on the edges of the face here. This will enhance the rim light effect, but is definitely optional. And finally, onto our color grade. First, a LUT adjustment set to Nightmare 02. This is from that custom LUT pack from Envato Elements. And you'll also want to bring that down to around 40% opacity. Then a high pass live layer set the overlay. Then we want to bring the radius up to 30%. And then the opacity down to 75%. So this will almost over-sharpen the image, giving it a grungy effect. If you don't like it, go ahead and skip it. Then let's do a fill layer filled with a dark blue, and set to lighten. We can also bring the opacity down to 75% or so. This is just to bring some blue tones into the shadows, which I think play really well with that bright orange. Finally, a live noise layer, set to 10% to make things even more grungy. I love that face paint effect because you can do just tons with it. It works for spooky Halloween makeup like this, but also for stuff like Viking warrior paint, or you can use it to create graffiti-like effects on walls. It doesn't have to be on a person's face. But that wraps up our final horror effect in Affinity Photo. That was 5 different photo manipulation effects perfect for Halloween, or if you're like me, the other 364 days as well. I like to think of all the techniques looked at today as, base techniques, meaning they are a fantastic foundation to build upon. Also to mix and match, that blood effect would look great with those stitches, and of course the zombie. Those glowy, witchy effects are basically universal. Glow effects make everything better after all. But that'll do it for today. If that wasn't enough and you're looking to learn even more, why not check out some of the other awesome videos that Envato Tuts Plus has to offer. If you like this video, thank you so much. Consider giving us a like and even subscribing if you haven't already. And don't forget to click the little bell icon to be notified of all new videos, including tips, tricks, and tutorials. Happy Halloween! See you next year.